Hello, and welcome to the fourth video in my Stahlenhag series on The Labyrinth. I will link to a playlist featuring the other videos here, in case you want to watch those first, but you don't really need to, as The Labyrinth is not specifically linked to any of the other books, though it could well be slotted into the timelines quite easily. In those prior books, Stahlenhag has taken us on a journey through a series of alternate realities, effectively presenting what-if scenarios that hinge on a defining scientific discovery or technological development that takes that version of reality onto a different and more fantastical path than this one. Through Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood, Stahlenhag led us through fictional recollections of an alternate 80s and 90s Sweden. A Sweden set in a world where global technology had developed much faster since the Second World War, and where artificial life, teleportation and floating skyships were a regular feature in their coming-of-age journey, from a rural childhood to their more urban adolescence. Then, with the excellent Electric State, we were taken to a turn-of-the-century USA, one riven with civil war, societal decline and a potentially enslaved human populace. Not to mention the emergence of a digital hive mind that was seeking to escape into the physical world using huge biomechanical drones. Oh, and a giant nightmare psycho clown drone. Oh yes. With these three books, Stahlenhag presented wonderfully provocative images that ranged from the nostalgic to the whimsical, and even to the horrific, whilst exploring the space between art books, world building and storytelling. I think it can be argued that the Electric State was the most sinister and unsettling so far, couched as it was in the unknowable terror of AI, and the dangers posed by an endless pursuit of technological advancement, driven by those only interested in its material rewards, and blinded to its many dangers by the pursuit of profit and growth. The captivating images of those curiously thrown together walking drones are iconic as they wander the empty streets of small-town USA, followed by dozens of neurolinked zombies, the orange glow of their neurocasters signalling their slow drift across the country. You also have the unforgettable waving barn drone that might be the genuinely most unsettling single image Stahlenhag has ever produced. And then there is the part where the aforementioned giant psycho terror clown straight up squashes an FBI agent. Is the Electric State the most horror-themed entry in Stahlenhag's repertoire then? Not anymore. The Labyrinth is set in a post-apocalyptic world, one where an inexplicable event has made the world unlivable for humanity and driven the remainder underground. But no, this is not the nuclear destruction and vaults of Fallout, or the disease and bunkers of 22 Cloverfield Lane. This is something entirely different. Initially at least. Mysterious black globes appear seemingly from nowhere, and much like J.K. Rowling, begin slowly poisoning the atmosphere. Over time, the makeup of the atmosphere changes enough that human life becomes unsustainable, and the very ecology of the Earth begins to break down. Humanity eventually cedes the surface to these mysterious emitters, emerging only to scamper between small outposts and to try and understand the changes they are seeing as the world is seemingly terraformed to suit some mysterious other, yet to reveal itself. With The Labyrinth, Stahlenhag takes us on a journey, weaving together survival, slasher and cosmic horror, all whilst providing fertile material for political commentary and ideological analysis. But first, a reminder of how these Stahlenhag videos work. This video is based only on the book itself, and no other media, interviews or analysis. It is going to be a personal interpretation of the themes, ideology and politics of the setting, and as such it may well differ from Stahlenhag's intention, but as I often say, that is the fun of art. It is a subjective medium and hopefully we'll find some interesting things to discuss together in the comments. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we?
In hindsight, it feels like everything went very quickly from one day to another, but I remember that I was restless, in a constant state of frustration that nothing was happening. I belonged to the research community, and we realised that if no drastic measures were taken, that humanity would become extinct. It was painful to have to see the world collapse as the politicians and public spent all their time trying to assign blame to someone.
So let's do some real low-key defining terms here. What is cosmic horror? Well, it's basically the fear of the unknown. But rather than the what's that noise in the attic unknown of traditional ghost stories, it's the What the fuck even is that fear of things we can't even comprehend? As per this, from cosmic horror heavyweight H.P. Lovecraft.
The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown.
Now yes, it would appear that in their personal life Lovecraft's fear of the unknown was largely limited to brown people and queer people, but Lovecraft's writings are normally the touchstone for this stuff with all of their indescribable horrors and unknowable terrors, so let's use one last instructive quote from the author.
The basis of all true cosmic horror is violation of the order of nature, and the profoundest violations are always the least concrete and describable.
In Labyrinth, we are faced with just such a horror. In the first image of the book, we are shown these floating black orbs, hovering maybe 20 metres up from the ground, with arc lightning shooting out of them and a sort of misty emanation falling from underneath, floating downwards in curious patterns. The scene is hazy, as if we are viewing it from amid a fog that exists as a result of those emissions we see coming from the black globes, as Stahlenhag calls them. Sigrid, our main protagonist, describes the situation as follows.
It was first thought to be some kind of cosmic phenomenon, as if our solar system had drifted into an unknown part of the galaxy where there were processes as yet unmapped by human science. The black globes appeared to follow rules and regularities that transcended those of nature or chance. Occasionally they could be seen moving in formation, patiently gliding through the landscape from one place to another, as if they were following a plan of action.
As if they were following a plan of action. And that right there is your cosmic horror. And thus, we begin to understand that these hovering pollutants are not a random event or a quirk of the universe, but are instead part of some great agenda, acting as they do, as if programmed or instructed in some way. They exist, and more importantly act, in response to stimulus that we do not have sight of. But to what end? Why are they here? Their primary process appears to be to terraform Earth to some great design that is beyond our wit to understand. Sigrid remembers this as their slow but seemingly inevitable impact.
The black globes had been pumping their toxins into our atmosphere for over a decade. People were sick and dying. Chaos was about to break out.
The threat was slow and predictable, with the consequence of inaction plain for all to see. And yet the familiar power structures of the world, built as they are on hierarchies of class and free market capitalism, were unable to coalesce around a single solution, as per this section's opening quote.
In hindsight, it feels like everything went very quickly from one day to another, but I remember that I was restless, in a constant state of frustration that nothing was happening. I belonged to the research community, and we realised that if no drastic measures were taken, that humanity would become extinct.
Does this sentiment feel familiar? Because it should. For me at least, this threat, this poisoned fog, stands as an easy metaphor for our own world's failure to face climate change, sharing as it does the same predictable outcome, and requiring as it does the same coordinated commitment to a solution. The consequences of inaction for Sigrid and their world are much the same as await ours should we continue to wait for salvation to become profitable enough for big business to be interested.
By this point, the atmosphere was noticeably difficult to breathe. Europe was breaking down into lawlessness. Unknown illnesses were spreading uncontrollably among the fleeing masses. There was total panic and desperation among the refugees.
This next quote talks of the Earth's final days as a livable environment for humanity, as our protagonists escaped into military-funded underground bunkers, abandoning civilization to its fate.
That summer, the trees never bloomed. The black globes had thickened the atmosphere to the point that what little sunlight reached the surface was not enough. The vegetation lay diseased and thickened in the ditches. It was a new kind of autumn, a long and drawn-out season of illness and death that would soon give way to an eternal, pitch-black winter. The water in the ground was starting to freeze, and soon a sooty snow would begin to fall. I remember that it was all so still. The screams had stopped, and in the new silence there was a kind of peace.
It would seem that this was the threshold, the point of no return, where even the world's hardiest vegetation simply couldn't cope anymore, and with that, the death knell for humankind was rung, and those unable to protect themselves were left to die, gasping and forgotten in the ashen snow of a dying world. Sadly, the threats to our own world are very much more knowable, and a hell of a lot less cosmic, and yet it feels like we're on a similar path to the world of Labyrinth. So let us move away from cosmic horror and instead towards survival horror, as we explore what life on this planet was like in the last days of civilization. A large part of The Labyrinth is spent talking of the decisions taken by the authorities once the threat of the black globes began to seem inevitable, and the consequences of those decisions, both at the time and much later. As mentioned before, though the threat was identified sometime before the surface became entirely unlivable, attempts made to combat the black globes had seemingly missed the mark, with the nations of the world failing to ever really coordinate any kind of a large-scale response. Thinking back to the UK's COVID response, and how we tried to rely on private medical research and equipment provision, and how the whole process was frustrated by a lack of knowledge sharing and auctioning off vaccines to the highest bidder.
We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top men.
And that's before mentioning how much of our strategy involved a bunch of grifters trying to make a quick few quid, whilst a whole bunch of people died and a nation waited in fear to find out just how dangerous this disease might be. Nations fought to buy priority access to the early vaccines, and the richer nations of course got the first batches, whilst the poorer nations had to suffer, purely as a function of the capitalist need to have profit included in every transaction. In The Labyrinth, one of the early suggestions for a solution to the threat of a world that was rapidly becoming unlivable was the creation of a Fallout-style vault called Kungshaw, which was mooted by the military as a way to ensure that humanity was preserved, or at least certain parts of it anyway.
When my brother told me about the Kungshaw project, I felt an indescribable relief. A project for our survival was being sketched out and I was needed. His friends within the military were willing to hire me on the spot simply because I was a doctor, and when Kungshaw was finished they would likely need my expertise in microbiology.
Now, before we go any further, let's talk about utilitarianism and what exactly this fancy word means. Chances are you already have some sense of what utilitarianism means via TV shows, books and video games that use it as a mechanic or cultural touchstone, but in essence we are using the word in relation to everyone's favourite meme format, the trolley problem. In essence, utilitarianism is all about making decisions that benefit the larger number of people, which seems like a perfectly logical approach most of the time, right? The trolley problem usually posits that there is a choice of which track for a runaway train trolley to take. On its current track, it will kill 4 people that are working on the track further down the line. And if you switch the trolley to the other track available, it will kill only 1 person. It posits the problem firstly as one of numbers and logic. Which decision will kill the fewest? Well, that's the correct answer. Then it says, but imagine you were the person pulling the lever that will switch the trolley to the other track. You are then consciously and deliberately taking an action that will kill someone, albeit for potentially good reasons. Logically, you are making the correct decision in terms of outcome as per the terms presented, but you are going from not being involved in a disaster to actively killing someone. You are choosing to end the life of the 1 to save the 4. This makes it a complicated moral question, but a simple utilitarian one, and you can keep adding more information to make it more or less morally complex. What if the 4 are older men and the 1 is a pregnant woman? What if the 4 were train robbers waiting to rob the trolley and the 1 was a child playing on the tracks? Utilitarianism as a philosophy explores these sorts of conundrums in an attempt to provide a moral framework for tough decisions, a way for society to exist despite the many competing viewpoints, interests and pressures. However, utilitarianism, like all things, can be warped by those presenting the information by which the decisions will be made, and for an example of that, simply look at the toxic pool of mediocrity that makes up the British Parliament. When the framework for a decision is entirely controlled by one, let's say, class of people, you can quickly find that the choice that is left is already skewed in a certain direction. People often joke about UK and US elections as being different colours of briefcase and little else, or as comedian Lewis Black once put it,
we have a 2-party system. The Democratic Party, which is a party of no ideas, and the Republican Party, which is a party of bad ideas.
It is therefore not unusual for those in charge of presenting the dilemma to manipulate the decision making to suit their desired endgame. Why are we talking about all this then? Because we live in a world where the suffering of ordinary people is often justified by smiling ghouls that tell us that things can't be improved because it would threaten the economy and jeopardise the life of the many. The effective altruism movement has similarly been gathering support amongst the more wealthy and right-wing members of society as a way of justifying short-term exploitation or hardship of ordinary people to sustain some nebulous idea of humanity. And more specifically, we talk of all this because the military in the world of the Labyrinth made some big choices as the world started to fail, and they justified their actions via a utilitarian or effective altruistic lens. Sigrid explains here about the situation at the time.
We were asked to construct a completely new, hermetically sealed society, a subterranean city with room for 100,000 inhabitants. We would do this as the old society was collapsing violently around us.
In a world of 7 billion people, to prepare a safe haven called the Kungshul Project for 100,000 is a choice, and the government and military will have made that choice on the understanding that certain people were of a higher priority than others when it came to a place in this sanctuary. Indeed, after a quick search online, Kungshul was the name given to a storehouse built in Sweden in the late 18th century that was designed as a storehouse for the local naval defences, and it's easy to see that the purpose and inclination of the Kungshul project are shared with this historic relic. Let us continue with Sigrid's scene setting.
By this point, the atmosphere was noticeably difficult to breathe. Europe was breaking down into lawlessness. Unknown illnesses were spreading uncontrollably among the fleeing masses. There was total panic and desperation among the refugees. Rumours of Kungshul and where it was located passed among the hundreds of thousands of people who were constantly streaming up from the south.
Imagine for a second a life where the very act of breathing had become a hardship, and you were watching your world become an unlivable wasteland, and you discover that your leaders and the military, the two groups explicitly tasked with protecting you, have plans to escape into an exclusive safe facility and leave you to die. Sigrid continues.
Cities were plundered and burned down in indiscriminate hatred. Violent groups joined forces in what started to resemble an open war against the military. In us, they found a mutual enemy. We knew that they had acquired powerful weapons. There were even rumours that they had obtained a new kind of biological agent. That was what we were most afraid of, that an infection would spread down in Kungshul, and the responsibility lay with us to make sure that something like that would never happen.
And there it is. Their utilitarian dilemma has decided that the Kungshul project must be protected for the good of humanity. Or to put it another way, the track with the 4 workers has been selected for the runaway trolley, in order to protect the one VIP on the other track, since the person in charge of the track selection is aligned with the one VIP ideologically. How does a person justify such horrors to themselves, you wonder? Well, Sigrid does some of that work for us.
Violence was everywhere, also on our side. It can't be denied that we would never have managed to complete the project without violence. One has to keep in mind that Kungshul was never intended to function as a shelter where you could squeeze in as many needy as possible. It was a carefully constructed, independent, life-supporting system completely separate from the surface of the earth. Each selected person with their individual skills and needs was accounted for in the calculation. The system would manage to keep its inhabitants alive for generations if needed. There were detailed plans in place for the gene pool of the entire population.
Could there have been more facilities built to house more of the population? Could the resources that were poured into creating and defending this site have been used towards a solution that would have saved everyone? And how quickly did those that made these decisions decide to write off humanity and invest so fully in this exclusive little shelter?
There was simply no longer any space to worry about how people up there were being treated.
And hoo boy, was there some question marks over that. And we will deal with some of the more specific horrors done in humanity's name in the next section. But let's just round off this section talking about the cold and calculated strategy that was applied in the name of the greater good.
A quarantine zone was erected. We swept through the zone like a giant search party hunting for trespassers. The fields were mined. Heavily armed robots patrolled the border. No one would be able to pass. When the doors to Kungshul were closed for the last time, we needed to be sure that the surface above it was secured. All possible threats to the project were annihilated.
utilitarianism as a tool for the inhumane, cold logic as a means for ensuring your interests are preserved at the expense of others, and technology used as a means of denying survival to those not lucky enough to be chosen for Kungshul.
The strategy was simple: deterrence. The methods grew from the bottom up, from the field patrols of the military police. We had no name for it, but one was not needed. We never spoke of it. The important thing was that it worked. The streams of refugees diminished. The violence and attacks abated. The message had been received. Whatever misery you are fleeing from, something much worse awaits you here.
Let's make a quick note here about the language involved and the ideological signifiers being used. Throughout Sigrid's descriptions of what was done in Kungshul's name, they always refer to we, as if it were a shared decision and not a hierarchical order, although that is exactly what it was. They talk of the necessity of these decisions as if it were perfectly justifiable, even though they were not involved in the decision making, showing that they have internalised the logic used to justify these actions. And they describe the decline of refugee incursion as proof that these decisions were in fact proven right, seizing upon favourable data to support their position, even when there were clearly many other reasons that people may have stopped frequenting the area. These elements all feel a bit like brainwashing, as if living in Kungshul includes a mandated dose of propaganda, and maybe that is entirely necessary given the atrocities committed in its name. There is a long history of propaganda in the military, particularly in the States, so it follows that a facility designed and maintained by them would likely feature a propagandist element. The military is not known for encouraging the breadth of thought, choices of approach, or believing in a political spectrum, all things that would have been brought into the facility along with doctors, scientists and other high priority personnel. Indeed, as time goes on and we learn more about life in Kungshul, it does appear to be a less than desirable place to live. But we can touch on that more as we talk of our final section of the video. So far, we have talked about how the inability to act on a global scale allowed for the world to be poisoned by the cosmic horror of the black globes, and how this was an effective metaphor for the free market's failure to tackle climate change. We've also talked about the survival horror perpetrated by the governing classes in creating an exclusive bunker for just 100,000 people, and how this was an example of how utilitarianism and indeed the trolley problem can be skewed by those that frame the question of what is to be done. We come now to our final section, and fans of 80s horror will probably enjoy this, as we're going to go into slasher horror. That's right folks, slasher horror complete with a masked killer and a horrifying backstory full of childhood trauma, failing institutions, and of course, revenge. In Labyrinth, we are mostly focused around 4 characters: our protagonist Sigrid, their brother Matt, a 13-year-old boy named Charlie that has been sent to accompany them on their latest expedition to the surface, and Charlie's dead older brother Alex. As mentioned in a quote earlier, it was Matt's ties to the military that got Sigrid a place in the Kungshul project, so both have been involved with the project since quite early on. Charlie's inclusion on the expedition is largely framed as a way to keep them out of trouble, since as Sigrid puts it,
Charlie was a child who acted out. The Kungshul school system doesn't have the resources for such a child. I can understand that. He was happy not to have to go to school for a while, and in addition, we were going to get to see the Earth's surface. We viewed it as a little adventure. A break from the daily routine at Kungshul would do him good. The negative pattern that had emerged at school would be interrupted. The psychologist agreed with us about this, so we took him along to Granhammer.
Granhammer is the name of the surface outpost they would stay at in between their different missions to collect data from the now very alien surface of the planet. So we learn that Charlie is somewhat troubled, and the military's capacity to handle any deviation from the norm has led to them effectively parking the troubled teen out of the way. We do not know at this point in what ways Charlie was acting out, or what the catalyst for this behaviour was, but we discover later that Charlie got their place at Kungshul as a young child, and that they navigated their way past the project's defences with their older brother Alex.
One day, we seized a young man who was passing through the quarantine zone. He was in his late teens, maybe 18, definitely not yet 20. He had his little brother with him. He was wearing a jacket with a red mark on the back, a red ringed fist. It was a symbol of Terra Proxima, one of the armed groups that wanted to overthrow Kung's Hall. Matt was going to have to walk him over to the field hospital, where the operations division conducted its interrogations. We both knew what that meant. Matt asked me to stay with the boy in the meantime. We did what was demanded of us.
We have already seen how Sigrid was effectively brainwashed to view the actions of the military as necessary, and this last statement, "we did what was demanded of us," reinforces how much they had suppressed their empathy for fellow human beings to a point that was dangerous. This is reinforced by the use of masks by military personnel in an attempt to make them more distinct from those they are suppressing. They talk a little of this later when discussing how they had been able to disassociate from their own actions much more effectively than Matt, who was seemingly haunted by the actions they had had to take in the name of the Kungshal project, as per this quote.
However well we understood the utility of what we did, our souls were damaged. It is, therefore, vital to be able to protect one's soul, and for that, strength is needed. I'm stronger than Matt, you see. I always have been. I've been able to keep the pain away, prevent it from destroying vital organs. It's as if I shrink up the pupil of my soul and in this way prevent its inside from burning up. Matt lacks this ability.
That is not to say that Sigrid wasn't affected by what they had seen and heard. There are certainly moments when we are allowed to experience a little of the trauma that has been accumulated in the name of their duty.
The memory came back like a film clip. The young men lined in a row, their heads bent, still boys, not much older than Charlie. The thrushes had grown fat on falling fruit. Was it the last time I saw live birds? The drone glided majestically and silently behind the island, like an enormous, mechanical, primeval creature, with the police walking in front of it. It was led forward through the wet grass. The muted thuds when it fired, was it muted because I held my hands over my ears? I wasn't standing very far away. The thrushes scattered at the shots. Bodies were ripped apart, one after the other. Disintegrated.
Even here, we can see the language used is as mechanical as possible. People weren't killed, but bodies were ripped apart. People weren't killed, they were disintegrated. They had simply moved from a state where they were a threat to one where they weren't. Sigrid also recalls one day seeing a dead woman left in the grounds near the project, and they speak about it so matter-of-factly that they even catch themselves not thinking of this woman as a person anymore.
In a ditch, there was part of a lower body, belonging to a young woman. White thighs gleamed in the dead grass, the skin peeled back like a soft husk where the body had been pierced by the bullets of the military police. I remember it was there, and then I realised that my instinct to avert my gaze had disappeared. It was what it was, and it was over.
The unemotional language is reminiscent in some of the reporting we have seen from Israel's atrocities against the people of Palestine. As put in the article entitled Palestine and the Power of Language by Elena Dudham for Time magazine in February last year,
the passive voice often focuses on the recipient of the event, not the doer. In the news today, I see only the passive voice. A group of Palestinian men waving a white flag are shot at, and I can't help but hear the voices of my past English teachers ask, but who shot these men? Accountability is not just vague, it's altogether missing.
There is also the way that in their recollection, Sigrid recalls observations of the local birds amidst the carnage, as they attempted to focus on anything but the acts of violence being committed in the name of the cause to which they are assigned. This trauma butts up against the military programming, the dehumanisation of those that they deem to be little more than violent groups, and are treated as if they were also a military force when civilians began to unify in what started to resemble an open war against the military. Upon arrival at the site of Project Kungshal, Charlie and their elder brother Alex are quickly separated, and Charlie is eventually given sanctuary in the Kungshal project. But they too experience trauma, even though they were not told what was happening to their brother, Who knows what horrors they had experienced in their journey to be there, without parents, without a means to defend themselves, and being desperate enough to throw themselves onto the mercy of a military force that was committing atrocities as a matter of course. Matt is described as returning shaken after clearly being involved in the execution of Charlie's brother Alex.
When he returned after the interrogation of a teenager, I saw that something in his gaze had changed. Something in his soul had been broken. He just sat quietly in his tent in the base camp for several hours. Finally, he emerged and went straight to the officers' quarters, where he remained for a long time. When he came back, he said to me, "We are allowed to take the boy with us."
We learn throughout the book that those who passed the roaming robots and ventured into the project's dominion were executed by beheading. They have a bag tied over their head, partly to make the cleanup less traumatic for those tasked with it, but also in another attempt to dehumanize their victims.
Some may pretend not to know, or that they have forgotten, just like me and Matt. But we all knew what was in those sacks. We know very well that it is thanks to their contents that we can live our comfortable lives down here in Kungshall.
It becomes clear that Charlie saw these bagged heads at some point, and this trauma affected him on a deep level. At the start of this section, we saw the quote that mentioned that Charlie was a child who acted out. The Kungshall school system doesn't have the resources for such a child. And this identified two key factors that helped shape the person that Charlie had become. Firstly, the traumas Charlie experienced before reaching Kungshall and after their brother is killed have damaged them on a fundamental level, with Kungshall's brutal utilitarian approach to security creating the conditions for Charlie to become an internal threat later on. Secondly, it is clear that the project lacks the expertise and empathy to be able to deal with children that deviate from their expectations. Perhaps this is unsurprising from an institution that was largely shaped by the military. It begs the question of how any other children with trauma, disabilities or behavioural issues were dealt with, and that Charlie might not be alone in being failed by the project's complete lack of appropriate support and guidance. Clearly at a loss of what to do with a child once punishment and scolding has failed to fix their behaviour, the project then ships Charlie off with Sigrid and Matt to the surface, in what feels like an attempt to get them out of the way temporarily, rather than deal with their issues. Matt, clearly suffering from intense feelings of guilt about having either directly or indirectly killed Charlie's brother, leaps at the chance to alleviate some of that guilt by working with Charlie on their trip, and they make many attempts to connect and reach a common ground with Charlie.
The entire way to the station, Matt sat in the lookout with Charlie. He tried to think of things to tell the boy about the world outside the all-terrain vehicle. When the sun appeared before us on the motorway, he told Charlie that the sun is actually not green, and that it is the ammonia in the atmosphere that makes it look that way. Charlie didn't say a word.
And
Matt did everything he could to try to reach him. He put his arm around the boy and said things like, "This is super rad, check this out," and "You're going to die when you see the thorns in this sucker."
Charlie, however, is quiet, withdrawn, and seems to be more interested in the retro tech available at the facility and the boombox they brought with them than engaging in social activities. And given that we know Charlie learned of what happened to their brother and that Matt was in some way responsible for their execution, this is perhaps unsurprising. We discover that it was when Charlie turned 13 that their more problematic behaviour started to manifest in the form of withdrawal as they went from being a chatty and sociable person to a much more introverted one, albeit with a predilection towards fighting fellow pupils. Early on, Charlie would often ask about their brother, but the project had chosen to lie to Charlie about their brother's death, instead claiming that they had run away and weren't coming back, and eventually Charlie just stopped asking. Sigrid literally says,
"We never talked about it with each other, but I assume he hoped that he had forgotten, that he had repressed his memories of his time before Kungshall."
But Charlie had either reasoned their way to the truth, or had used their place inside the project to confirm their suspicions. The first signs that Charlie may in fact be a threat to Matt and Sigrid comes in a startling mood change whilst they are chatting in the kitchen.
While Matt was frying the pork fillet pieces, We drank the wine in our plastic cups and chatted about all manner of things. Matt told me about his new job down in the West City, and I complained about the staffing shortages at the hospital. Suddenly, Charlie stood in the doorway. He had something over his head. The kitchen was fairly dark, and at first I thought he had his hood pulled up, but then I saw from the pattern of the fabric that it was one of the station's pillowcases he had pulled over his head. Both Matt and I became dead quiet. "Boo!" Charlie said, behind his pillowcase. Matt and I stared at each other. This didn't even happen when he was younger and extroverted. "Jesus, Charlie, you scared me," I said with complete honesty. He shuffled over to me with outstretched arms, moaning. As soon as he was within reach, I grabbed the pillowcase and pulled it off. His hair was rumpled, and he gave me a strange look. In the dark, I couldn't tell if he was being serious or making a face, and that made me even more nervous. I held up my hands like claws and growled at him. And then he just sighed and shuffled out of the kitchen again. I glanced at Matt. He looked terrified.
At first glance, this might just seem like the slightly awkward teen was trying to play a joke or to connect in a way that negated the tendency towards isolation that they were feeling. But that pillowcase, and Matt's reaction. Matt knew then, I think, that Charlie knew all about the executions, the heads in the sacks, the masked soldiers, and what had happened to their brother, even if it took a while to admit it to themselves. But Matt knew, and a day or two later...
Matt was distant and quiet all day. He had clearly slept very little, but there was something else as well. On the way back, I tried to chat a little, but he just sat there with an empty gaze. When we finally arrived back at Granhammer and I turned off the engine in the garage, he suddenly grabbed my shoulder. "He stood by my bed last night," he said, "just like in the kitchen, with the pillowcase over his head."
Now this is a pretty scary encounter for anyone, but with the added context of the pillowcase, it becomes very threatening indeed. A context that Matt clearly understood all too well, even as Sigrid denies it. Matt wants to approach the subject openly, come clean with Charlie about their part in their brother's death, and try to talk through the subject. But as per their statement earlier, Sigrid simply stonewalls the issue and refuses to engage with it, lest they are wounded by their own trauma.
Matt sighed and said, "I think he is starting to remember. The pillowcase, Sigrid, isn't it obvious?" I didn't answer, and instead went up to the counter and rinsed the plates. Matt sat hunched over with his head in his hands. When I was going to wipe off the table, he took hold of my wrist and said, "Please, Sigrid, listen to me. I really want a chance to explain. I'm sure he would understand if I talked to him. Don't you think it would be good for him? The sacks..." He interrupted himself with a feeble whimper, putting both hands over his mouth and trying to suppress his sobs.
Things finally escalate when there is an explosion and the power to the Granhammer station cuts out, leaving it on emergency power and bathing many parts in a thick and threatening darkness. Sigrid reasons that Charlie would be startled and heads to the computer room after checking the kitchen in an attempt to find either Charlie or Matt. What Sigrid does finally find forces them to face the truth about Charlie.
Charlie's computer was on, and there was something on the screen, so I stepped closer to read what it was. It was self-evident. His introversion, the outbursts, the fights at school, none of it had anything to do with hormones. This was not a case of adolescent troubles. And the pillowcases... Dear God. Matt had been right the whole time. Charlie knew.
We are then shown this image of what was written on the screen.
I know what you put there. I know what's in the bag. I know what's in the bag. I know what's inside the bag!
Much like the scene in The Shining where Wendy finds the typewriter with the hundreds of pages of "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," this revelation is what confirms for us, the reader, what we had already suspected. But more than that, it hits home for Sigrid that Matt is in danger. We then switch to Sigrid, describing what they think transpired between Charlie and Matt, as they are shown in a darkened room with Matt going in to embrace Charlie.
Some things can never be fixed. And the question he should have asked himself before entering that room with Charlie is, can we ever be forgiven for the crimes of which we are guilty? I don't think so. In the end, he must have understood what was in the sacks, and he wanted to make it clear to me that he knew. In a way, we are even now. We took his brother, and he took mine.
What is interesting though, is how even as the consequences of their decisions have now come to fruition, Sigrid still struggles to accept that those decisions taken were in any way wrong. They reason with themselves that the only way Charlie was able to smuggle a knife inside of their tape player was because Matt helped them to smuggle the boombox out of the project, in an attempt to alleviate their own guilt. Sigrid still positions Matt as the weaker of the two, even though Matt had the courage to not only accept their part in the creation of the person Charlie had become, but also to try and fix the damage they had caused, even if it meant opening themselves up to the danger of retaliation. With the station on emergency power, dark floodwaters begin rising throughout the station, and Sigrid states,
When I stood there by my brother's body, the water arrived. It welled up from the interior of the station. The cold red corridors were filling up with water, and then I did what I should have done that afternoon 7 years ago. I abandoned the boy.
The Kungshul project has created a classic slasher villain, one that has claimed the sacked head of their slain brother as part of their grim identity, mirrored by the pillowcase they don when intimidating their intended targets. A slasher villain with a clear creation story and a pathway you can map out very clearly from start to finish, leaving us with a new mythological figure wandering the alien landscapes of a terraformed Earth. A villain shaped by trauma, hatred and neglect, framed by a green sun, a new dawn and a new danger on the surface of a broken Earth. My interpretation of the book's name, The Labyrinth, is as a reference to the layers of defence erected by the Kungshul project. The mines, the drones, the armed guards, all pointed outwards in an effort to protect the centre of the maze, the underground facility. But unlike the Greek myth, this maze was designed to keep people out as opposed to keeping a monster in. Though ultimately I suppose they did have a monster in there. It is up to you whether that monster is the fascistic society that damned the rest of the world, or the child that harbours dark thoughts of revenge. Charlie is the human personification of the horrors the Kungshul project inflicted on the world. Whilst we can perhaps sympathise with Matt's remorse for their part in Charlie's trauma, Sigrid's refusal to accept their own failings beyond just following orders means I'm left somewhat cold to their eventual fate, which I won't spoil here. As ever, Stahlenhag leaves us with more questions than answers. Was there ever a scenario in Stahlenhag's mind where Earth could have unified and found a solution to the black globes? Or was the Earth's downfall inevitable from the moment the globes arrived? I personally find it hard to believe that the Kungshul project and the actions taken in its name would ever be seen as justifiable or optimal, though I can't speak for Stahlenhag's mind. Is any kind of completely prescribed and controlled environment really capable of preserving humanity? What form of humanity would exist as a result of having to live this way? One where only the ideology, culture and history of its founders was taught, where your life partner was selected to maximise the gene pool spread, and where life is predetermined to such a degree that humankind would quickly become unrecognisable. I haven't really touched on the new surface world in this video, or the flooding towards the end, and this is mostly just as a result of wanting to keep this video to a reasonable length. But I suspect there are some fun parallels to be made with Noah's Ark and the idea of cleansing floods to wash away sins. In fact, the Labyrinth shows us a very small amount of the larger world, how it all works now that the terraforming appears complete, what Sigrid and the other scientists have discovered so far, and to what end all this was done. We see snippets of gigantic new species of flora, wrecks of old military drones, and a strange tentacled creature in a yellow vat in the labs of Gran Hamar. But as these aren't really the focus of the story, they aren't explored in any real depth. Certainly Matt's presence on the surface expeditions appears to be as a bodyguard, though we are never really told what Sigrid might need protecting from. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Stahlenhag ended up returning to this setting in future, as it feels like it's ripe for more development, though perhaps as part of a roleplay game as per their previous books, where the setting can be fleshed out further. Thinking back to the 4 books I've read now, The Electric State remains my favourite Stahlenhag book to date. But the horrors of the Labyrinth certainly proved very captivating, and the twists and turns of this tale may well stay with me a long time. The horrors of a dying world, of humanity's capacity for cold, large-scale violence, and the resulting trauma of children are at the forefront of my mind as I close this book. And it speaks to the growing confidence of Stahlenhag's storytelling that it is these narrative beats, and not their breathtaking visuals, that will stay with me long after. Thank you all for joining me in another of my Simon Stahlenhag videos, the last for the time being. It's been a hell of a journey, where we have taken in rural childhoods, mid-apocalyptic sibling adventures, and now post-apocalyptic horrors. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, as we ruminated on strange references, hints and images to try and speculate about what it might tell us about the wider worlds that Stahlenhag was creating. Thanks go out to Mrs. InsideLeft for all their help with the scripts and filming, to Nico, whose mic I'm still using for every video, to Advent Song for the use of their 4 excellent tracks, and to the members of WeCreateTogether who have very kindly lent their voices to this video. You'll be able to find details of exactly who they are in the description. I suspect we may come back to Stahlenhag again, whether it be with their other books, TV shows, movies, or their roleplay game books, which expand on the worlds we have already seen. But until then, be kind, take care of each other, and see you soon. Bye for now.